Our first keynote speaker is an acclaimed writer, and his books are so good that he keeps on winning prizes. But he doesn't keep his skill, his gift to himself. He actually shares it by teaching writing in our very own diocese. He teaches at Goldsmiths College in New Cross, and I used to walk past Goldsmiths College every day on my way to school. This was a long time ago. But I took his latest book, Light Perpetual, on holiday with me. It was my beach book. And after reading it, I would describe the writer as a philosopher. Only a thinker, a ponderer on the meaning of life could have come up with such stories of the impact of quality of life and how it impacts us all. And so it gives me great pleasure, it's a real privilege to introduce Francis to open up the conference, Communicating Forgiveness to a Culture That's Forgotten It. I invite you, please, to put your hands together as we welcome Francis Spufford.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. Excellent. I have reached the stage in my life where I have to choose between seeing things close up and seeing things far away. I know that bifocals exist, but really. So I'm going to do that. Are you all still there? Make some noise. Thank you. When I was writing my attempt at an apologetic that contemporary culture might actually hear 12 years ago, I thought the biggest problem then was persuading people that there was something they might need redeeming or saving from. After all, a savior or a redeemer is not a very functional idea without that. There needs to be a problem before Christ can be a solution. And a lot of the ways in which the church was then attempting outreach seemed to me to duck this issue. On the liberal side of the church, there was a tendency to try to reach out by offering inclusive Jesus. Jesus as the friend of women, Jesus as the abolisher of the line between in-group and out-group, Jesus as God's yes to justice movements and equality movements of all kinds. And don't get me wrong, all of those things are genuinely there in the Gospels. The fire that has been burning in the world since Pentecost does, among other things, burn away at the dividing lines between, well, Jew and Greek, slave and free, men and women for a start. I am myself a liberal, albeit a liberal saved by the blood of the Lamb. But all of those good things, intelligible outworkings, though they are of the gospel, are also available in the world in completely secular form, leaving the question still unanswered of why you'd bother with the religious version when you could have the one without the awkward metaphysics, the one which didn't make people look at you in a funny way. Meanwhile, at the more conservative end of British Christianity, there tended to be an extremely solid four-letter word understanding of what Christ saves us from: hell. Again, don't get me wrong, in the book I eventually wrote back then, I was more dismissive about hell than I should have been. There needs to be a name for the possibility of saying a final no to God's love. Final on our side, at least. Our Lord is notorious for not taking no for an answer. Every time we say the creed, we remind ourselves that even hell is within his reach. But on our side, yes, we can damn ourselves. Our doctrine of free will requires it. The trouble with using the get out of hell free card as the reason for faith, though, is twofold. In the first place, it's circular. It requires you to believe before you believe. It requires you to believe in the prospect of judgment and damnation as your reason for believing in the prospect of mercy and redemption. You need some supernatural apparatus, it said, because of some other supernatural apparatus. And in the second place, it effectively invites people to up the ante, to abolish the alleged problem by a more thorough act of disbelief. If it's good news that God wants to save you from hell, then it must be even better news that there's no hell and no God. So it struck me back then that if you wanted to show people what Christianity could do that wasn't available in secular form and that couldn't be dismissed as offering protection from imaginary threats, then you would need to talk about what, in our own undeniable everyday experience, we could do with being saved or redeemed from sin, basically. Sin, of course. Sin not as a category of abstraction or as a cosmic crime against the law codes of the Almighty, but as a felt and familiar source of sorrow and wreckage in ordinary lives. Sin as the all too ordinary urge to act from spite or greed, to do harm, to exercise a destructive power, to treat other people as things or tools. I decided that the first thing I needed to do back then was to become a propagandist for the existence of evil, or even just for there being a tragic dimension of human life, a way in which things routinely went wrong for people. It seems odd to remember now, but compared to the present, 2010 was a rather Pollyanna-ish time. Things had taken a lurch with the world financial crisis, true, and the warnings of climate danger were getting louder and louder. But in this country, at least, there hadn't yet been the years of austerity that sent people to the food banks. The hospitals and schools had been rebuilt. The problem with our politics appeared to be a slightly inhuman-sounding blandness across the political spectrum which filtered out the vulgar noise of human passions. Remember that. There were still people who thought that history had ended with the triumph of liberal democracy. Obama was president. London was an international city getting ready for the Olympics, and the atheist bus was cruising about with, written on its side, "There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life," which was already a ridiculous slogan, but at that moment, not instantly and self-evidently ridiculous. It took some explaining to point out just how much of human existence was being excluded there by the idea that life, if not messed around by nasty Bronze Age stuff like religion, would be just fun. Now, though, Now, hunger has returned. Now, the autocracies are rising, and even British and American democracy looks wobbly. Now, our politics is a constant display of unfiltered passion, and not in a good way. Every night on TV, there are pictures of some part of the planet burning. The ice caps are melting. The temperature sets new records. There is a war of conquest in Europe, now in its 8th month. Diseases go round the world faster than we can manage the international cooperation required to stop them. Young people are phenomenally anxious and afraid. Optimism looks stupid. Hope remains a religious duty, but it's not an easy virtue to practice these days. I can't say I'm pleased by this. I personally would have settled for some sort of quiet acknowledgement of human destructiveness. This kind of non-stop, 24-hour, day-glow, global demonstration of our capacity to wreck the joint seems a bit excessive, don't you think? But one thing is for sure. The case for human life having a tragic dimension does not need making anymore. Or the case for thinking that individually and collectively, our species is equipped with urges that work powerfully against our happiness and well-being. We have all the proof of human depravity before our eyes that the grimmest Calvinist could ever want. Absolutely something to be saved from, to be redeemed from. The diagnosis of the human condition that we in the church have always been offering doesn't sound like a scare story anymore, some nasty, stale, old gust of pessimism from the antique past to be banished by orange juice and antibiotics and enlightened attitudes to sex and by going shopping. It's observable. To our sorrow, it's observable. There was always quite enough suffering to be going on, really. And, as Christians, I know I don't need to remind you of this, we are, in fact, opposed to suffering. It's just that it's become inescapably visible. And this is a situation in which, on the face of it, you'd think it would be easier to get on with our task, our apologetic task, our missional task, our pastoral task, whatever you want to call it, the urgent activity of reaching out to our society with the good news, which all of this spate of bad news ought to have been preparing people to hear. You'd think that the whole of our society would now be in something closer to the position of one of those groups to whom faith has always been able to speak clearly, because the people in that group already know from bitter experience that they've got a need for redemption. Prisoners, for example, or even more so, addicts, people who know that they need a path out of trouble that isn't within the reach of their own unaided willpower to provide. You'd think that the trouble we're all in now collectively would have the same kind of effect, only more widely, tearing away the illusion that an atomized consumerist individualism was going to be enough to get us all through. After all, it is those individual consumer decisions aggregated which have filled up the seas with plastic dreck and pumped up the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. But this doesn't quite seem to be the case, does it? We are still having trouble being heard. Only the reason why has shifted. The problem, it seems to me, is no longer getting people to believe the diagnosis. Now, it's getting them to believe there might possibly be a cure. I think we've moved over the last decade from being a society that has difficulty with the idea of sin to one that has difficulty with the idea of forgiveness, and therefore with the idea of redemption, and therefore with the idea of a redeemer, and therefore with the idea of Christ. I'm saying that our problem now isn't a deluded optimism that cruelly hides the human plight. Our problem now as a culture, and as a society, and consequently as a church, our problem now is something more like despair, guilt without the possibility of an exit from it. So I want to talk this morning about some of the ways in which our society presently ties itself in knots on the subject of forgiveness, and then about some of the ways in which I think the church can inadvertently play into this in a way which is, how can I put this, not always totally helpful. Society first. I think the first thing to observe is that the return of the sense of guilt is highly selective. It is biased towards the big evils. It is really not the case that we as a society have taken to meticulous, miserable self-examination over the ordinary details of our romantic and sexual and social and family lives. The horrible thing we said at work last Wednesday, the cruel way that we dumped our last boyfriend but won. Nope. The remedy for the disquiet that we feel over that kind of thing, and we do still feel it, remains the suggestion that we should just get on with things. dismiss the bad stuff in the everyday mix as just some inevitable tints in the colour palette of life, and not be too hard on ourselves. The massive 2-generation, maybe 3-generation change in how the British lead their private lives remains in place. Serial monogamy and blended families remain the norm, except maybe in zones of social privilege, where there's the nasty implication that having a marriage that lasts has become yet another piece of social capital that's unequally distributed, reserved for the upper middle classes. The poor get step families that last for a decade or so. Jacob Rees-Mogg has 6 children, a nanny, and a Latin wedding mass in Canterbury Cathedral. Who authorised that? And regulating our private lives on the whole remains a strictly consequentialist ethics, as philosophers would say, where the only rules are that you shouldn't do any harm, narrowly defined, and that you should always get consent, both of which are obviously good things, right? There are whispers of general alarm from time to time over the long-term consequences of this cultural settlement, such as Louise Perry's recent book arguing that the sexual revolution maybe wasn't that great for women, and who knows what cultural changes the future may hold. But on the whole, the landscape remains settled, the landscape within which people do their moral thinking about their private lives, and beyond which they don't readily have the option to go, given that the complicated blended families they have are populated by people they love, people to whom they have obligations, even if they aren't always quite sure what those obligations entail. Which is another reason why I think that there are limited prospects for the idea, which you sometimes hear from the conservative end of the church, that Jesus really wants us to live in the 1950s. But there's an exception. The one thing that has changed sharply in the moral estimation of private lives is a newly powerful awareness of and condemnation of sexual relationships that are predatory. Child abuse is at one end of this category of evils, obviously. Contemporary scandals and historical scandals, many in the church, continue to be uncovered. It continues to look as if both the post-1960s world and the more buttoned-up one that preceded it contained many quiet seams of horror. But since #MeToo, there's been a cultural shift that exposes and condemns a much wider field of predatory behaviour, by men towards women, the older towards the younger, the powerful towards the less powerful. We have a much clearer picture now of what has been going on in the sealed compartments of institutions, in ballet companies and sports teams and theatres, and it sometimes seems everywhere else. I work in a university, Goldsmiths, Lewisham, and there are many attempts now to regulate away the possibility of abuse by forbidding any cross-age or cross-power relationships, kind of in a similar way to safeguarding, trying to eliminate children being abused by forbidding whole areas of interaction between children and adults. But the tools for prevention seem much weaker than the evil. The background to all this enhanced awareness of predation is the lowest ever conviction rate for rape in Britain. That's a reason for despair in itself. An aghast awareness of an ill that apparently can't be checked. If there is forgiveness here by the attacked towards their attacker, it is not likely to come as part of a process in which they also obtain justice. It will be a private and solitary act, a letting go of anger that some people find their way to, not others, and which won't necessarily signal an end to trauma. Perhaps it will be more like a sort of resignation even. Let it go, nothing to be done. Then there are the hateful sins that our contemporary cultural divides assure us that our opponents on the other side of the divide are guilty of. Enabled, accelerated, driven onwards by social media that specialize in eliciting outrage and do it by removing charity and nuance. I am not just talking about so-called cancel culture here. That is itself a weaponized, uncharitable portrait, a deliberately uglified portrait of an enemy. The rapid recourse to hate and demonization is not, thank God, universal, but you can find it on every side. Leavers hating Remainers and vice versa, socialists hating conservatives and vice versa, nationalists hating unionists and vice versa, the proponents of trans rights hating so-called TERFs and vice versa. In every case, the rational and temperate voices that exist on every side of all of these arguments struggling against a flooding incentive to collapse the discourse down into just hate, 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 hate. The American psychologist and blogger Scott Alexander has a useful conceptual tool here. He says that everyone has an in-group, an out-group, and a far group. The in-group is people like you, people who agree with you. The out-group is people who are nearby and who are like you enough to be culpable for their errors, who get the important things hatefully, loathsomely, disgustingly wrong. And the far group are people too far away to be part of your internecine dispute. You can see the virtues and vices in them in a cool and unworried way. They, compared to the rest of your experience of the world, are exotic. And this is why, for example, picking an example not at all out of the air, but an impeccably liberal-minded white Remainer may find it easier to get on with a polite Muslim taxi driver with extremely patriarchal views than with a Brexiteer who agrees with them about feminism and gay rights. If Alexander is right, these three groupings, differently configured for different people, exist in all societies at all times. The difference now is that we have a machine in place for keeping the sins of the out-group always before our eyes, maddeningly, goadingly present, productively present for those whose business model requires engagement at any cost. And these are not trivial problems confined to the phone in people's hands. They encourage all or nothing confrontations. They make cooperation much harder. They justify the running down of necessarily cooperative institutions like law and parliament, because the upkeep of the institution is going to keep being less pressing than winning this victory and this victory and this victory against evil them. And in terms of forgiveness, all of these are perceptions of evil directed outwards, self-righteously. They, over there, are the ones who need judging and condemning. And maybe later, vaguely and uncertainly, the prospect of forgiveness might arise once they've admitted just how thoroughly wicked they are. There isn't the assumption of shared fallibility, shared corruptibility even, from which forgiveness can most easily arise. A point we'll be coming back to. There is also, I think, a new factor, enabled, unfortunately, by some of the ways in which the idea of forgiveness has been publicly cheapened and misused in the past. This is the perception that to let an evil go, to drop the hounding of somebody for committing an evil, is to make a judgment that the evil itself was unimportant, to trivialize it, to excuse it even. A culture that believes on some basic level that to forgive someone for a wrong they've done is the same thing as saying it wasn't very bad, that's a culture which is going to struggle with redemption. Which, if someone says, "Behold, I make all things new," may reply, yeah, but are you saying that we don't care about hate speech anymore? We shall come back to that too. And then, last of all, in this extremely rough and ready anatomy of the contemporary sense of evil you're getting, there's the desperately crumbling state of the world, as manifested in the climate crisis, which results partly from our inability to cooperate our way to collective action. As shown in the disintegrating loyalty to institutions of politicians, you can always get more of an advantage by breaking rules than by tediously sticking to them, not thinking of anyone in particular there, oh no. As proved by the yawning inequality of life chances now, as visible in the return of pandemic disease, as audible in the anxieties of teenagers who perceive the world as hopelessly dangerous and cannot bear the thought of becoming adult men and women if those identities are as represented by the perfectionist, insatiable, pornified media engine. All of these are evils that share a common structure, if you think about it. They are all collective problems to which we contribute individually. They are emergent phenomena resulting from a lot of ordinary human greed, corner-cutting, indifference to suffering far away, appetite for glamour and transgression, responsiveness to the packaged and concentrated versions of the stuff that our limbic systems like. We know we're at fault. We know that the little vapor trail of our own destructiveness is going upwards and contributing to the great big cloud up there which threatens us all. But, this is the catch, all we can do about it individually is by some mighty effort of will to cut off our own contribution. We can sort out our recycling. We can try not to fly. We can try to hold the line about screen time for our children. Yet none of these reverse the evil we perceive, which rolls on whether we practice virtue or not, which is a recipe for moral helplessness, for despair in itself. Who will forgive us for our participation in a whole society's destructiveness? Should we be forgiven for it? So, to recap, we've got a resigned sense that people's private lives are what they are and that criticism of them is probably snobby and judgmental, except with the addition of a newly horrified awareness that at all the raw points of sexual life, the powerful are likely to exploit the less powerful. Pimps cultivate children in care, traffickers flock towards refugees, but we don't really expect much to be done about it. Meanwhile, across all the contemporary divides, a lively sense of the evil of other people's attitudes flourishes. The in-group is okay. The far group is okay. The out-group is vile and pernicious because they pose an existential threat to all that is sacred. And all the while, our fault, but not something we can stop by any solitary individual action of ours, the environment degrades. Boy, I bet you're glad you hired me to get to your conference. Off to a cheery start. Bear with me, though. Hope coming up shortly, I promise. Now let's look at the church and what we offer to this despair-prone society. In theory, what we say is very clear. We say mercy is not an alternative to justice. It is the completion of justice. Where people injure other people, they should be caught and there should be consequences. Turning the other cheek does not mean going along with evil. Forgiveness does not mean saying that evil is okay. As the Reverend Julie Coleman of St. John's Palmer's Green told the drug dealers who complained when she moved them out of her church porch, "I'm a Christian, not a doormat." We recognize that there is a limit to how much and how completely we, as fallible mortals, scarred by our injuries, frightened, not perfectly generous, can forgive the wrongs done us. And we also recognize that we're not supposed to preempt the moral integrity of other people by trying to forgive wrongs done to them on their behalf. Whether they can forgive, whether they're ready to forgive, is up to them. Our own sins are our concern, and that's quite enough to be going on with. But we also know that our limited, halting capacity to forgive is not the only game in town. God's forgiveness has all the capacity we lack. We are commanded to forgive as much as we can because we know we need, on our own account, that greater and unconstrained generosity. Jesus explicitly told us to try to behave towards other people as we hope God will behave towards us. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. I am not a New Testament scholar. I don't know New Testament Greek, but that "as" in the Lord's Prayer appears to be as productively ambiguous in the Gospels as it is every time that we say the Lord's Prayer now. Forgive us in the same way as we forgive other people, because we forgive other people, to the same extent that we forgive other people. I do hope not that last one. But the Lord is very insistent on there being a connection between our faltering attempts and his never-ceasing mercy. It is somehow because of our repeated, mostly failing efforts to imitate him that now and again the miracle of mercy takes root in human affairs, and some ancient and tragic process we didn't think we'd see the end of is ended in mutual acknowledgement of wrongs done, and a space is made in which a new thing can begin. Our clumsy forgiveness can be the channel down which his life-giving water flows. In theory, I said a minute ago, didn't I? But what I've just described is practice, not theory. It's what the church really does try to do and to be, in my experience. Tries, fails, tries, fails, tries, fails, doesn't give up. I only say it's theory when it comes to what people know that we are and do. The perception of the church when it comes to the forgiveness we're trying to offer the world does not always correspond to what and who we actually are. Our theology of forgiveness is only a theory, an idea up on a high shelf somewhere, if it isn't visible out in the culture. And if you know nothing about what Christianity looks like from the inside, and you don't know any real, live, human Christians to cross-check your opinions against, it is, for example, possible to believe that forgiveness is our code word for taking evil lightly, for being indulgent to predators, just the kind of predators that Me Too has got people noticing the actions of. We have got better at taking safeguarding seriously, I hope and trust. But anyone who has paid any attention to the historic cases of abuse coming out of the church has heard how, after the abuse, the reflex of endless authority figures of ours has been to try to weasel out of action by talk of forgiveness. It's there in what happened with Peter Ball. It's there in the John Smith case. People know this stuff. Often it's all they know about our moral record, along maybe with our famous homophobia and misogyny and our structural racism. Let's not forget that. What can we do about this? Apart, please, from stopping doing it. Even if we do stop doing it successfully, it's going to linger in the culture. It's going to echo about in people's store of common wisdom about us. But one thing we can do, I think, is to make sure that whenever we get the chance to state our actual doctrine of forgiveness, we state it in its tough form, the form with teeth. The scandal of grace is really important, but it doesn't come first, always, in what you need to understand. And if you encounter it on its own without the context, it can be mistaken for the other kind of scandal, the scandal of trivialization. So we need to say, when they let us say it, forgiveness requires the acknowledgement of guilt. You need to be sorry to be forgiven. And being sorry entails being willing to accept the this-worldly consequences of the bad thing you did, which may involve punishment or disgrace or loss of position and status and reputation. And then comes the tireless work of grace in making new beginnings possible. God hates nothing and no one that he has made. God is more generous than us, finds avenues for hope that we cannot. But God is also less subservient than us, less concerned, in fact, utterly unconcerned about the good name of institutions and powerful people. He does not care which of our cherished illusions he lays waste to in the name of mercy, but he also doesn't care what inconvenience or confusion or overthrow he flings around in the pursuit of justice. We should get into the habit, where we can, of talking as if human fallibility and corruptibility are just givens and are universally distributed, not reserved for those we disagree with. Knowing you share an identity as a sinner with those you oppose, and that you need mercy as much as they do, is a good basis for the recognition of common humanity. But it's hard knowledge to arrive at. A society without much practice at admitting fault has also had little practice at discovering that being in the wrong is survivable, is sometimes a relief, is liberating even, by clearing a space in which something new can happen in a life. How we encourage the discovery of this, I do not know. I leave it as an exercise for you. But I do have one modest suggestion. I request the preaching of a great many sermons about the Good Samaritan, in which we restore the original disruptive power of the parable by pointing out that the person willing to help the mugging victim did not come from the in group where Jesus' hearers were concerned. Those were the priest and the Levite passing by on the other side. Nor from the far group either, safely exotic. Those would have been Romans, Greeks, Syrophoenicians. Deliberately and upsettingly, Jesus insists that love comes, help comes, love in accordance with the commandment comes from the out group. The people who, like the Samaritans for first century Jews, are like us enough for it to really matter that they get things loathsomely and unforgivably wrong. Which group that will be for Christ's maximum disruptive effect will depend on who you're preaching to. I urge you, in fact, I think I dare you, to be as offensive as our Lord on this point. But, does this mean that we don't care anymore about hate speech or the oppression of the marginalized or structural racism? About the diagnosis of the systematic injustice of the world that we ourselves share, whichever diagnosis exactly it is that we make? Are we supposed, in the name of preaching sin and redemption, to settle for a picture of things in which there is only individual culpability and all the larger issues just float away? No, absolutely not. The Christian vision is not a privatized one. We need the vision of the good city as well as the vision of the redeemed soul. Umpteen different visions of the good city, of course. What we are trying to do by disrupting the contemporary compulsion to project all evil outwards onto them and to reserve all innocence for lovely us is to restore a shared sense of humanity, common, fallible, plural, open to change. By preaching that, as Solzhenitsyn put it, the boundary line between good and evil runs through every human heart, we are actually restoring a greater, because more realistic, belief in human agency. Fantasies of blame directed outwards are a recipe for despair. The important causes, all of them, remain, and the way to effective action about any of them lies in the embrace of the grubby truth about ourselves. We can't be actors in the arena of justice unless we have a realistic sense of who we are as we do it. There is one more way that I want to mention in which I think the church sometimes unwittingly plays into contemporary despair. And that is where our acts of penitence in worship nowadays roll together all our separate sins towards the world into one giant collective blob in a way that reproduces the secular sense that the whole thing is too big and too lost and too awful for anything we might do to make any difference to it. Specifically, some kinds of eco-penitence, especially inclined to do this, but it's there more ordinarily as well. In common worship, for example, replacing the sins of the world, plural, various, with the singular sin, singular of the world, vast, uniform, fed by 6 billion tributary souls. Saying sorry for what we have done is important sometimes, but do it every time, and it both closes the space in which the person 3 rows from the back may urgently need to confess her individual guilt at refusing to have her mother-in-law with early onset dementia living in the house. And also, perversely, it kind of lets people off the hook for the global sin of bad stewardship. A huge collective responsibility is, unfortunately, a bit like no responsibility. It floats over your head again in church, impervious to anything you might do. We shouldn't accidentally offer people a religiously themed version of the hopelessness that they came in with anyway. Saying mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, and beating your breast may run the risk of taking on too much responsibility for evils that transcend the person, but at least it restores the focus to the individual soul and thus to the place where things can happen between a person and their past, between a person and their Saviour, whose forgiveness is without limit, between a person and all the people that person knows as a child, a sibling, a lover, a spouse, a citizen. We sin in our millions and we are forgiven one at a time, each of us God's unique beloved. And then we go out to do things in our millions. And in here, it's really very obvious, and I'm sorry for the oodles of depression I've prefaced this with, it's really very obvious the thing that the church can offer to contemporary despair. The common logic of our world at the moment is, well, it's as in Psalm 49. For no one indeed can ransom another or pay to God the price of deliverance. To ransom a soul is too costly. There is no price one could pay for it. It's all about limits. All about the miserable recognition that our strength is too small for the problem and we can't help each other, maybe not even ourselves. And to this despair, God has replied. Into this logic of exhaustion and limit, the foolish creator of all has brought himself, a third party who can be killed by love but not exhausted, to pay the price of our limits. I could talk for hours more, but I won't. I will just say the world needs hope, and we have it.